Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be covering how I composed, produced, mixed and mastered my piece Impromptu for clarinet and strings, which is the piece you're listening to right now. There's a link in the description in case you want to check it out. The first step, as it's usually the case, is sketching out the actual arrangement for the piece, which means the first decision is finding out how many arrangement tracks you would need. Now, these come determined by the instrumentation of the piece. In this case, we're talking about a clarinet and strings. So I thought 3 tracks would be enough in this case. One of those tracks will be used for the clarinet and the 2 others for the strings, being one of those used for the main stuff and the other one for counter melodies and counter lines in general. As you can see, each track has got its own color, which makes it easier to work around counterpoints and overlapping in general. The 3 tracks are pianos, which is something I don't always do, especially if the instrumentation is going to be a full orchestra, where I would use 1 or 2 tracks for woodwinds and the same for brass and strings. Like in the case of my piece Red Lipstick, which you can check out how it was composed, produced, mixed and mastered in the description as well. The next step would be figuring out a general tempo for each part of the piece, as well as a general time signature. Now, when it comes down to time signatures, I'd rather not go for the actual signature the piece is actually written in, but the time signature that would make up 1 beat of the actual time signature. This would be, for instance, a 1/4 in a 4/4 time signature or a 1/8 in a 6/8 time signature. I do this for 2 main reasons, one of them being having more control over each individual beat when it comes down, especially when it comes down to adding tempo fluctuations, as we'll cover later. And the other one being not having to worry about constant time signature changes in a piece where those would be happening all the time, like in this one, especially in the second part. Obviously, I'm talking about time signatures that share the same beat, the same unit here. So once that's done, I would set out to sketch out the actual arrangement for the piece. Now, keep in mind that while all the lines and counter melodies and chords and whatnot are being laid out here, I might have not decided what articulations might go where. Of course, I've got a general idea of what's going to be long articulations or what's going to be short articulations. But for instance, when it comes out to short articulations, I have not decided yet here if I'm going to be using spiccatos or staccatos. This also applies to tiny elements, tiny articulations like pizzicatos, leños, and other elements that I might decide to add later on during the production process. With the sketch being done, I would move on to adding tempo fluctuations, which is a bit of a tricky thing. This has to do with how the piece breathes. If you've ever been to a concert but there's a live orchestra playing, you will have seen how it is very hard to figure out the actual tempo of any given piece because it is in constant change. These tempo changes might be very subtle, but the key here is that they are constant, which is what makes an orchestra breathe. And one more tool we can use to bring more realism to our mockups. The next step would be MIDI programming, and the way I go about this boils down mainly to copying the MIDI data from the arrangement tracks and pasting it onto any articulation track I might need at any given point. As you can see, I have 1 track for each articulation, which gives me more control over each individual track and also over each individual negative track delay. I only tend to use ensemble patches for tiny details that are not going to be the focus of the whole thing. In this case, pizzicatos, leños, and that sort of thing. When it comes down to MIDI automation, I mainly work around 4 different parameters, namely velocity, CC1, CC11, and vibrato. Now, apart from adjusting these parameters to taste, there are a few things you can do in order to improve the realism of your mockup. The first thing is choosing as many libraries by the same manufacturer as possible, especially if they've been recorded in the same room. These will make it easier for you to blend them and mix them, which will also speed up your workflow. Because not only do they sound the same since they've been recorded in the same room, but the MIDI parameters, the MIDI automation will respond the same way between patches and libraries, making copying and pasting even more powerful of a tool. In this case, I only used 3 libraries, which are Spitfire Symphonic strings, Spitfire chamber strings, and Berlin Woodwinds. Another thing I do in order to enhance the realism of my mockups is altering the automation lines of instruments that would be doing the same otherwise, in terms of automation, of course. For instance, as you can see here, all instruments are doing the same, but at the same time, each instrument has got its own individual line. This blurs out any noticeable transitions that might occur, especially when you've got a bunch of instruments that have been programmed the same way, doing the same thing. Another thing I do is blur certain patches attacks with a different articulation layered on top of it, being mainly legato patches. These smoothes out transitions between notes and make them feel more real overall. Notice the difference here between having these trills on their own and having them layered with legato patches. When it comes down to mixing, the first thing you've got to be mindful about is proper routing. In my template, I've got all tracks that belong with any particular instrument routed to that instrument's bus. This applies to all the other instruments, the same for ensemble patches. Of course, the same applies to the clarinet. And finally, I've got one extra bus, which is the strings bus, where all the other individual string buses are routed to. By doing this way, I've got control not only over each individual instrument bus, but also over the whole ensemble, the whole strings ensemble. Another thing worth mentioning is that I applied 2 compression instances on the clarinet bus. I did this in order to bring that extra glue to all these different clarinet articulations to make them feel more like they're coming from a single player. When it comes to mixing, the things you've got to keep in mind are, first off, overall balance, which means that all instruments should sound pretty much the same in terms of volume. As in, you shouldn't have any instrument sticking out dramatically over the rest of the ensemble. And second, that each lead element is not being masked or buried by other elements that are not that important. As far as this piece goes, there's 2 orders of magnitude. On one hand, there's the clarinet, which is the most important element all throughout the piece. But on the other, there's the string ensemble, where certain lines are to be brought out at certain points. The way I go about it is, first off, as I said, I make sure that all the elements can be understood, can be heard. And then I solo the lead element of each particular moment and compare it to each other individual element that is sounding at the same time. If there's any masking going on, I would attenuate that second element enough for the lead one to be clearly understood. I might decide to bump up the lead element as well if I see that by keeping on attenuating the other element, the overall balance would be compromised. There is a rule of thumb I really like when it comes to knowing how much you should attenuate or bump up a track, which is using a 3 dB value as your starting point, always a 3 dB value. So basically, if you think that something needs to be attenuated by 3 dB. If it sounds better, maybe try 6 dB. If that sounds worse, but worse than when it was at 0, chances are the sweet spot is somewhere between 0 and -3 dB. I like using this method because I often find myself caught up in tiny differences, tiny subtle things that over time make me lose perspective and focus. That's why I like this rule of thumb, because 3 dB is enough of a difference for you to know straight away if something sounds better or not, even if it's not the perfect amount of reduction or increase. Another thing I do in order to find out what is masking a given key element is mute one track after the other and see after which muted track the masking stops. In the way of masking, I also find very helpful mixing in mono. This makes spotting these problems easier. Basically, if you've got two elements that are in conflict with each other but are located in very different places in the stereo field, you might not notice that there's actually a problem. So that's why if you don't check your mono compatibility, you might miss the masking. After that's done, I'd move on to EQing. There's an EQ built into the template, but I always find that I need to tweak it depending on the instrumentation and the piece itself. As far as the strings go, the two main things I did were cutting out the low end, which is just noise, and attenuating the mid-range buildup. There's also EQ applied to each individual track. As far as the clarinet goes, the two main things I did were a slight bump around 4K to give it a bit more presence, and a high shelf on the high end to bring out those clarinet noises and air. Basically to emphasize that the clarinet is in front of the orchestra and closer to the listener's position. The next thing would be applying parallel compression. The idea behind it is beefing up the original mix without losing any of the transients. That's why there's quite a bit of compression going on. After that, I would adjust the reverb sends, and in some cases, I would automate those sends as well, as you can see here. This has to do with how rhythmic or how busy each part of the piece is. Basically, the rule here is the busier, the drier. But keep in mind that there's got to be a cohesion throughout the piece, so any changes made should be subtle. In this case, I use two different reverbs, one to handle the early reflections and one to handle the tail. After that, and after creating a bit more separation between instruments with panning, I'd go about creating separation between the string ensemble and the clarinet. The first thing I do is apply a dynamic EQ to the strings bass, and setting the sidechain to come from the clarinet bass. The idea here is to target those frequencies in which the clarinet lifts. So every time the clarinet plays, there's a slight dip in the strings to make room for it better. The second thing has to do with the stereo field. Basically, I would make the clarinet bass a bit more mono to make it feel like it's coming more from the center. And at the same time, I would attenuate the mids on the strings bass to make that extra room for the clarinet. After that, I'd go about mastering the mix. The first thing is splitting the signal into mid and side to have more control over the stereo field. Second, I'd add a bit of compression, and since the same parameters have been applied to both the mid and the side, the mids are getting slightly more compressed, which brings a bit of widening to the mix. Now keep in mind that the amount of compression being done here is very little, barely RDB. After that, I'd apply a bit of EQ, where I'd basically attenuate a bit of the high mids on the side to give the clarinet a bit of extra room. Let's remember that the clarinet is living in this frequency range and basically on the mid. After that, I'd apply a bit more compression following the same principle as in the first instance. Also, keep in mind that you want the attack to be rather slow and the release to be rather fast in order to preserve as much of the transients as possible. After that, I'd add a bit of upward compression, mainly on the mid around the frequency range where the clarinet lives in order to bring it out a bit more, and on the side, on the high end, in order to give it a bit more texture. After that, I'd add a bit of limiting without reaching the threshold. And finally, I'd move on to the master bass. I'd attenuate the very lows, basically any noise that might be left, and I'd bump up ever so slightly those mids in order to give the clarinet that extra push. Next, I'd apply a high shelf to give the mix that extra crispiness. And finally, a bit of widening by using wider and a slight bump on the high end on the side. The last step would be matching my master's loudness to my reference track's loudness, which in this case was a recording of Aaron Copland's clarinet concerto. So that's about it. I hope that was helpful, and please feel free to drop any comments, ask me any questions about anything I said, and I hope you enjoyed the video.